Hey,
It's
Uberboyo, how you doing?
good, my man. You can call me Steph as well if we
Oh,
want to go with
Steph.
less.
Well, I might just continue to call you Uberboyo.
That was actually on the birth cert, so maybe it's more accurate. Yeah, that's why that's
No,
what they
I'll
call
call you.
me.
I'll call you Steph. Yeah.
Well, whichever you prefer.
No. Okay. Well, let's get started. We'll have to talk more about this. I might save this for Thursday when the other shoe has dropped. But it does seem like Donald Trump is going to be indicted over election interference with J6, possibly treason. I guess what this sets up for me, just my immediate take, is that, if we thought the 2016 election was kind of existential, it's like, are we going to be a nation with borders or not? And then, and that it was existential. And then in 2020, I jumped off the bandwagon, but everyone else was like, are we going to have fair elections, or is the deep state going to steal everything from us? And I think 2024, I don't think I'm exaggerating. It's almost like setting up for the last election. And I don't want to sound hysterical, but Trump, you win or you go to jail. And even if the DOJ wants to offer him an olive branch and maybe keep actual jail off the table or commute the sentence or whatever, win or you're dead is how it's going to be perceived. And I don't know. I see a lot of interesting extremism. I don't I know that's a loaded term, but I see that in the air. I mean, even something as kind of small as Nick Fuentes' event. Um, Nick Fuentes, he gave a speech where it was this weird combination of like Zoomer streaming gossip and extreme Christian nihilism. I don't know how to describe it. It was he spent a lot of the first half of the speech bashing other streamers and talking about how dudes are banging their wives left and right and all this, he no longer likes iDubbbz or whatever the hell. I mean, there was a lot of just detritus that I don't care about. Apparently his people do. But then when he switches into a different mode, everyone's on Twitter, they're posting this clip of him saying basically, we're willing to die in this war against effectively the Jews. And because we're willing to die, we're going to make them die. And he actually wants to eliminate enemies of Christ from America and the planet. So I presume that might also mean me, but perhaps I'll be let off the hook a bit. But it's very strong rhetoric, and even beyond that, there's this memento mori of like, you are already dead. Your being is towards death, and this life doesn't matter. And I think that in the on the whole, it doesn't matter. You're going to be judged before God by what you do. Now, you could take that on one level and say that, oh, this is the typical kind of quietist piety of Christians where they deny the earth and all they want to do is read their dusty old books and then walk into the grave like a bed or something like that. But that kind of mentality can go in reverse, where you're already dead. The only thing that matters is judgment before God, and God wants you to eliminate the enemies of Jesus Christ, his son. Um, that seems like that can be an extremely motivating force. There's a kind of desperation that I sense in him. And so anyway, I if that kind of talk is in the air, and Nick also mentioned something that is absolutely true. And this also goes for BAP, who I have, in a weird way, I have like a lot less respect for than I do Nick Fuentes. Like, I have, in a way, no interest in BAP, but Nick is kind of interesting. But it's like he said this in his event. All these people at TPUSA, they're also fans of mine. They're attending both conferences. They people from America First or the Knicker crowd are infiltrating TPUSA, and that's actually true. There was a doxing from a journalist. I just happened to see on Twitter where it's like this Knicker fan who has all these photos with Nick is now Benny Johnson's social media director or something. So perhaps Nick is overstating matters, but he's not wrong. And so I don't know. I think I think we're headed for an existential crisis. And it's all kind of stupid and it's easy to make fun of. And Trump, we love to mimic him and he's a goofball and he failed in president, all that stuff. Or Nick is some crazy little Zoomer incel, whatever. All that, it's easy to make fun of these things, but I see the passion and the power of fanaticism and belief in them. And I don't see that among liberals. We liberals like myself, we just want Trump out and we want old man Joe to kind of, steer the boat in a steady manner. We don't expect much. Just be normal, bro. That's what we want. I'm speaking for all Biden voters, but I think I'm correct. They don't want that. They are talking about being willing to die, and that's something pretty powerful.
I'll let Steph respond to this because he's the guest. But yeah, the reason we brought you on, Steph, is because we wanted to talk about Nick, and we also wanted to talk about Tate, which I think we'll get to in the second hour, hopefully. And because I think that you'll give us a different or interesting perspective there. And also, I think you're a good sort of counterweight or counterbalance to Rad Femme Hitler, who we occasionally have on the show as well. So we encourage a kind of diversity of voices here, with a certain window, I would say. Mm-hmm. Yeah, why don't you give us your take on Nick and the latest developments with the Kreupers?
Yeah, so I'm somewhat politically naive. I come from Ireland, so this is all and entertainment from a distance to me. The Ireland is a tiny little country on the fringes of the American empire. Maybe I know we kind of tacitly, esoterically rule America at the moment through Mr. Biden.
Yeah,
but I have no connection to power. It's nothing that's ever interesting. I'm like Greece and the Roman Empire. I'm a cultural man. I'm not really too concerned with what's going on in the Senate type thing. But I did watch Nick's recent video on Rumble, where he was talking about the Jews. He was sorting all that stuff out, and it's actually fascinating to see the archetype show up again, like the Christian, the Jews kill Christ type thing. It's almost like, and some people, I can't remember who said it. It was probably a Jungian idea where he says that the myth always returns, and so you actually can relive the experiences your ancestors probably had, and it's just so surreal to see that stuff come up in maybe the context of modernity, where you think that you're away from the past. And one thing that really interested me about Nick was he's got a very, very strong character, like an incredibly polarizing and binary and extreme character. And it's so fascinating because there's a huge amount of mimetic strength in that, specifically the fact that he's like a totally black-pilled incel. It's amazing to see this, and we're going to talk about the Tates later, and they're like literally the polar opposite in some sense, but they're equally extreme. And Nick reminds me a little bit of maybe what Nietzsche would talk about with Schopenhauer's ascetic ideal, because Nietzsche has this almost like Buddhist radical denial of the world, like I anti-sex, anti-self-improvement. Like I heard him talking about this, and he's like, there's no point going to the gym. I even heard him say there's no point trying to self-improve, there's no point trying to make yourself better, and God has made you as you are. There's this like deep pessimistic black-pilled fatalism to him, and there's no, you've got your fate, you've got your destiny, it is what it is. Now this is so extreme, it's so weird for us to think like this, No sex is bad, women are useless. This is very Schopenhauerian, like women are demons, do not get pulled into this. And this gives him a sort of liberation, because what does Schopenhauer's conclusion come to? He's like, all we can do is we can try to grab hold of the psychotic will that lives inside us and try our best to spend it on something that is moral, try our best to erupt it into the world and create a great work of art, so that we waste it instead of allowing it to express itself as something evil and demonic, like, trying to have sex or trying to participate in the world or whatever it is. And Nick really has that moral energy inside of him. Like, he conquers all of these instincts inside of himself, his inceldom, all of these things, his will to change, his will to improve, his will to participate in the worldly strife of life. He crushes all that. And then what floats up on top of that is a moral vision, a moral demand upon the world. And that becomes his being. There's literally nothing there except that. And you're saying that this fanaticism has strength, and you're 100% correct. This is like the sort of extreme nihilism that I think Nietzsche was flirting with, because he was saying, he would always say that nihilism could be really, really powerful, and also a sign of extreme sickness. And maybe even inside of Nick, you see both of those things manifest, like a deep sickness that leads to a deep strength, because he's got nothing to lose. He's like all fucking in. And that dude is like, man, I'm going up there and I'm going to talk about the thing I care about. I think he said something like Kanye West offered him to work on his project, and Nick said something along the lines of like, I'm just here to dismantle Jewish power. And you're like, holy shit, this dude's all in, man. Like, he's just like, I'm going for the jugular. I have one vision. This is it. And he's fully committed to it. And I don't see how he could be like this without that deep, almost like disgust for life, or rejection of life, and something like that. It's actually kind of amazing to see the force of character that he has. It's maybe amazing for me to see, I guess you could say, a philosophical concept. I see Nietzsche bitching about Schopenhauer, and then you kind of see it manifest in the flesh. You're like, wow, like that's what he was talking about, and there it is, right in front of you. So I think that's maybe my best take. Hopefully that adds some color and context. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, well, I think we're saying some similar things here. I think the comparison between Schopenhauer is very interesting, and just the like incels, they've painted themselves into this corner to the point that they are nihilist at some point. It's not just, I want to get pussy. Fair enough. It's something like metaphysical at this point. And I think Nick is, whether he himself is actually an incel remains to be seen. I doubt it, but he's representing them, and he's kind of tapped in to that energy. But go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, no, I think it's a healthy sort of sifting that's occurring here. Because I think that part of the DR is really, and it goes back on some level, it goes back to this sort of Platonist Nietzschean division that appears in the DR. And those are the Platonists, right? Nick is on the side of the Platonists. And you actually can see people who are Platonists kind of cleaving toward him, because they're ultimately sort of world denialists. They're spiritualists. They believe that the world is a kind of illusion, a temporary illusion, and the real world is this kind of heaven or idea world, almost similar to what Plato conceived of, right? So I think that that's a healthy sifting that's occurring. And to Richard's point, there is a dynamism there. There's power there, but there's also a kind of lack of sobriety, which, for example, the Romans, I think, would be a kind of model of. There's a kind of Roman sobriety, or stoicism is not the right word. I think sobriety is actually the best word to describe it. So there's a wildness there, and there's a chaos there. I think it ultimately leads to disaster. And I hate to say, because there are things that you can admire about Nick, and that you can find him charismatic in a way. But I think that his movement is basically off the rails. It's gone, like he's gone insane, essentially. Because in the other thing too is it is, as far as it being a Christian movement, that's kind of a joke. I mean, we can say that there's this sort of power in not believing that the real world is actually real, because then you can say, well, fuck it, there are no consequences. I can go out in a blaze of glory. Right?
Yeah.
So you could say that, but you could also say, well, if the real world is not real, then why don't I just be a degenerate and do drugs? Or right. So you could reach either conclusion.
Yeah.
Right. But that is, and this is related to the sort of the bipolar nature of his movement and people that would be drawn to his movement. On some level, they're degenerates, let's be honest, right? So I would say that, but I would also say from a Christian perspective, it is completely incoherent, right? So Christianity is not ultimately anti-Semitic. That's a misunderstanding of Christianity. Not only is it a misunderstanding of the kind of creedal aspects of Christianity, which are very radical in terms of submissiveness generally to one's enemies, do not resist the evil person, turn the other cheek. All those things, you can read them, from the text, and the way that you interpret them or understand them in a kind of neutral. I mean, they're not being taken out of context. This is what Jesus is saying, and this is what the early church fathers understood him to be saying, and what they also preached. So what his movement is not a Christian movement, but it is a movement that is using some of these kind of insane elements. It ultimately is a kind of explicit death cult. I mean, the guy's got skulls up there behind him, right?
Yeah.
He's got skulls, and then he's
got guns and ammo,
guns and knives, right? So I mean, it feels like a huge Fed net, if I'm also being honest. I mean, it's not like he's not behaving in a kind of rational way, which is one of the reasons people love it, right? It's a shit show. It's the traffic accident that everyone slows down to gawk at, right? And if there aren't consequences for Nick, who already could be very easily hung for Jan 6. I mean, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that he played an important role in like explicitly encouraging people to, break down barriers, go into the White House and stuff like that. They already have that on it. So if there is no fallout for this, I would find that suspicious, to be honest with you. The other thing too is that, like, even though he's had success recently on this Fit and Fresh, which went massively viral and had, by the time it's done, I am sure it will have had millions of viewers. I don't know what the numbers were, but that is a kind of an illusion ultimately. I mean, I think that he had at his last event, he had like 1,000 people. He's now getting like less than a quarter of that. He's getting like 150 people to his events. So people are less inclined to associate with him in the real world, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily lessen his potency in some other dimension, like his online potency in this sort of thing. But it does change what his movement represents. He's now against the system. And we'll see how that works out. I mean, I don't think that I think that if he does not face severe consequences, people should be asking questions why. You know what I mean? Because they already got him for Jan 6, in my opinion. But
I doubt
he's declaring jihad against Jews.
Literally.
All right, okay. Well, let's see how that goes. You know what I mean? And it's to say that he's talking about violence now, right? And it's not really even that implied. It's sort of implied, but it's not really that implied. And then he's showing guns and skulls, right? So we'll see what happens. But you were going to say, Richard?
Richard, you muted. Something might have gone on.
Richard, you're still muted, I think.
Do you want me to fill in?
Yeah, jump in.
I was going to ask you. So, did you say that he had 1,000 people at a public event, a rally? This is probably back when the Kanye thing was going on.
Like a year ago, or I guess they call it AFPAC. So AFPAC 3, I think he had I think people were saying that. I don't know if that's actually
also, he 1,000, 500, 1,500. It doesn't matter. He had Marjorie Taylor Greene up on stage with him. He had members of Congress sending in video love letters. I mean, it was this gets to. I'll give the mic to Steph real quick, but it gets to this interesting contradiction. And I guess you could say it's bipolar, but maybe it's dialectical, and it kind of feeds off, one side feeds off the other, in the sense that, when he came into this movement, it was basically an attempt to de-radicalize the alt-right. It was, get away from all that, high racism stuff, get away from like the Spencer Nietzsche stuff, don't talk about the ethno-state, don't do anything like that. Just blend into the wallpaper of conservatism and just say you're an American nationalist, you care about the country, and you love Trump. That worked for him, actually. And I think he was popular among normie conservatives to some degree, in the sense that he was like just this funny elfin kid who loved Trump, and they're like, and but then now he's gotten to a point where, I mean, I'm not going to self-righteously denounce the kid or something like this, but I am going to soberly look at this. Like, you start telling people you're already dead and we must remove the enemies of Christ from the planet. That sounds a lot like ISIS to me. Like that is an ISIS ideology. And the fact that it involves young incels is also brings it in line with that. So like, yeah, this might not go anywhere. It's not, what he did is not illegal in itself. And I would stress that, but like, where do you go from here? Outside, I mean, this is a path that he's on that leads to one place, and that is his own death, and among others. And I don't know, it's more intense, it's more overtly Christian than QAnon, it's smaller than QAnon, we should say that, but maybe more kind of potent and radical in a weird way. So I just think it's important. I'm not trying to be self-righteous. I'm not, trying to be a hall monitor, but I think you should soberly look at where this kind of thinking leads. It leads one place. We've seen this over and over again. We've seen Christian anti-Semitism over and over again throughout the ages. And it might be contradictory for people like Steph and Mark and myself, who we actually want to read the Gospels and look into it and look into the history, etc. But it also happens. It recurs over and over again. And it's a kind of hysterical reaction where you don't know if you want to worship a Jewish God or convert Jews to Christianity or kill them all, or claim that they're, blood libel, claim that they're boiling matzo balls in the blood of Gentile babies. I mean, these things are real things. They happen. And I don't know. Like I'm struck by what Steph was saying of just this recurrence of motifs. There seems to be something embedded in the Christian mind, and America's a peculiarly Christian nation. Nick's a Catholic. America is a Protestant nation, but regardless, it's embedded in there, and it's like a little ticking time bomb. Like, it can activate itself in this way. It can also activate itself in terms of support for Israel, philo-Semitism, the Christian Zionist stuff that we know well. And that remains a far, far larger movement than what Nick is doing. But both of those little time bombs are there, and they've been placed in their mind through logic, through scripture, through insinuation, through this kind of hysterical dynamic that Christians have with Jews. And so I think we should look at it very soberly. I don't get hysterical and claim they're, these are school shooters or whatever, but I think take their words seriously. Like, Nick put thought into that final hurrah of his talk. He put thought into that. So let's take it seriously and ask, what are you implying? Like, what's step 2 in this blueprint that you put forward?
It's actually a very interesting way to categorize it, to talk about even about ISIS. And I understand you're not, you're just pointing that as an example, because the topic that we're going to talk about Andrew Tate and we're talking about Nick here, and I guess you could look at them as leaders of men, and it's fascinating to look at them and just analyze their prescriptions for men dealing with the nihilism of modernity, the confusion and chaos of modernity. Tate's like, get into fucking Hustlers University, get your bitches on OnlyFans, like, you know, put your sister on OnlyFans, whatever it is. And he gives you a prescription of, if you want to be able to deal with modern life, you've got to get rich and get strong and get a car. And that's how you deal with the struggles of modernity. And he animates and motivates a huge amount of men to this. And it is actually amazing. Like, we'll definitely talk about him a bit more in a bit. But he is like fantastic he's amazing at motivating young men. I've met many of them. And then Nick is, as I was describing, this is what's really struck me about him, is that he actually is very good at motivating young men, although his audience is much, much, much smaller. But it has that sort of fanatical, extreme energy. And it really is related to this it's idealism, like as you were bringing up Plato earlier. And I think Mark was mentioning Plato, and I'd like to stress something that Nietzsche said, because I think this explains a lot about the psychology here. Like, Nietzsche was talking about the priestly type, the world denier, and he was pointing out about the ascetic that yes, he denies the world ideologically, yes, but the will to power is still there. The energy is still inside that man. So when the priest sits down and orders all of his passions, maybe the warrior lifts his passions up and allows his like lust and his desire to conquest to nakedly explode out of himself. The priest instead comes up with a rationalization to deny all those, and he pushes them deep down inside of himself, and he categorizes them as evil, just like Nick's saying, that urge inside of me is evil. The desire to have a fit and healthy body is evil. This is all worldly nonsense, and he pushes it deep down in himself, but he doesn't crush it. He doesn't get rid of it. That's impossible. And so the will actually develops more potency. It manifests and transforms and morphs and appears as a new force. And because the priest has the intelligence, usually, because that's what a priestly man usually is, he has the intelligence and power to crush the inner urges. The will to power now expresses itself as like this desire to transform the world, which is what we have with morality. You know, this is what we have with a moral crusade.
Yeah.
And you see that extremism boiling up out of him. Like, he's saying to himself, I want to like, he's going for the jugular. And that really speaks to people. That's really intoxicating, because I remember when I was a young man and I was in college, I would meet the people who were into Antifa, and it was always very attractive to be around them. Like, they were idiots. They were stupid. Like, they didn't, like, obviously now that I've gotten a bit older, I listen to them and they're anarchists. But anarchy sounds awesome when you're a kid. It sounds badass. It's like, let's go and, I don't know, cut some power lines or some fucking bullshit or something like this. But it's sexy, it's powerful, it's energetic, and it's brutally idealistic. It's big. It's like, we are going to transform the world with these actions. And you really see this in why people would be drawn to what Nick is saying, is that he's going for the biggest dream possible, and he's sacrificing everything for it. And those two binaries like move people. No matter what you say, they are very, very, very compelling. And I think they're actually probably the reason why he settled on it, is because it's compelling to him. It gives his life meaning and purpose. It gives him a sort of direction. He sits down and he says, like, what would I be without this? And he gives himself over to it completely and becomes what he is. And I think he has an immensely strong character as a result. And it's kind of like, you know, that's intense, because he's obviously been pushed into some corners for what he believes, and it's forced him to sacrifice everything else. And so he's becoming more potent as time goes on, you know. And like, he lost Kanye, and it's like, it just keeps consolidating, and God knows how that's going to erupt. Like, it just gets more and more potent, and as we said, it's going to have to release itself at some point.
Yeah I would say, I think that one thing that we shouldn't misrepresent, and I think that this idea that you know, obviously there is a history of some element of anti-Semitism in the church and Christianity, you know, through the medieval period, and it but I think that this becomes exaggerated, and it was actually more commonly the role of the church to protect Jews and have form a sanctuary for Jews. In fact, even in the current day, we see actually sort of a similar phenomena where the church is not anti-Semitic, right? I mean, the Catholic Church cannot be described as anti-Semitic. Now, it's been more anti-Semitic in the past, you could say, according to a certain definition of that term. But generally, there has been a dynamic between the church and the Jews of there's been a tension there, but they've generally found ways to get along. I mean, that's actually the history of the church, right? So anti-Semitism is kind of more of an exception in the church than it is the rule. Now, again, there have been pogroms, and there is
populist.
this
There's
idea.
a dynamic.
Well,
Yeah, no, but you're trying to like you're trying to claim. Look. The dynamic that recurred over and over was the state, in many ways, the principality would very often protect Jews, but there was a populist revolt against
including
them
the church, including the priests,
including
right?
the priest, yes,
including the clergy. So it's a laity phenomenon,
right?
So what Nick represents is a kind of laity phenomenon.
Yeah,
it isn't like sort of theologically sound, or it's not really based on a coherent understanding of what Christianity actually
but the
is.
theology kind of lays the seeds. I mean, this is the irony of the Gospel of John or something, is that on one level it is anti-Semitic, on another level it is profoundly Jewish or Judaic. I mean, Jesus, you can say the same thing for Jesus. I mean, he kind of breaks the law while he's attempting to fulfill it to the utmost degree. It's like we don't need to worry about all these niceties and all these pedants who are obsessed with details. But actually, I want to look deep into your heart and discover your true intention. If you want to sleep with a woman, you have slept with a woman. If you want to kill someone, you have killed someone. He fulfills the law while negating it. I mean, I think Hegel is very useful in understanding this Aufhebung, which means cancellation, overcoming, and fulfillment all at the same time. And so there is that. I mean, there's an element of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish resentment or suspicion, let's say, that's implanted within the Christian mind. And yes, historically, early Christians are Jews. There's no doubt about it. Paul's a Jew. I mean, I could go on. Jesus is a Jew. I could go on and on and on. And historically, over the past 2,000 years, you could find absolutely instances of the church effectively protecting Jews, if critically sometimes. But it's that seed is implanted in the laity's mind, and it erupts.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it is a kind of vindictiveness and jealousy that's inherent to the religion, right? You're worshiping a Jew.
Yeah.
So Gentiles are inherently less divine. So it's, so it has that unhealthy psychological component to it. My point, though, is essentially that what we're witnessing is a kind of peasant revolt.
Yeah.
Right. Now you're correct in saying it is ultimately infected by Christianity, right? This becomes a motivation element to it, but it's a motivating element to it, but it is ultimately on some level incoherent. And it doesn't, it's not, they're not being good Christians, I guess is what I'm saying. But yeah, I guess but whether we want to argue this is a kind of feature or bug of Christianity is another interesting question.
Yeah.
Right? We might understand it as a feature of Christianity.
Exactly.
But maybe ultimately a kind of unintended feature of Christianity. It's unclear, though. I mean, it's not, because it does seem like some of the anti-Semitism that appears in the Gospels, which is not really anti-Semitism at all. I mean, it's kind of, there are bad Jews and there are good Jews, effectively, is how it breaks down, right?
Yeah.
So you have examples of good Jews who want to include the Gentiles in a new covenant, and who are multiculturalists, essentially, and egalitarian. And then there's examples of Pharisees, for example, who are separatists or bad Jews. But what's being taught there, of course, is a anti-tribalism, that this is the parable, where we're all supposed to be one in Christ Jesus, right? As the famous Galatians line has it. But I would say, though, that that because of I think that the original intention of this parable that appears in the Gospels was I do think that there is a kind of Jew baiting going on, definitely in the Gospels, where there's a kind of obligation to portray to a pagan, an anti-Semitic pagan audience. Let's be honest here. You have to portray Jews in a kind of, you have to give them the sort of the caricature they want. You have to give them the Jew who is, who's intolerant, who wants to kill someone for having the wrong opinion or the wrong theology, right? You have to give that caricature as a kind of Jew bait for them to be like, oh, okay, well, there's some truth in this religion because it's depicting Jews honestly, or it's depicting some Jews honestly, right? But whether or not this kind of peasant anti-Semitism, which is a consequence, obviously, of elements in the gospel itself, is a kind of intended consequence, or something that is just a bug, is I guess it's more of an academic question, I suppose.
I think it's intended. It is an academic question, but it's important. And where would Zionism be without anti-Semitism? And even if you look at a curious figure like Bap, you see a lot of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, to sell the Gospels, is you're selling it to anti-Semites on some level, right?
Yeah,
you're selling the gospel to anti-Semites on some level. So if that is if that's the first chromosome, or if that's the DNA, then I guess you could say that it is a sort of intended thing, where there will remain in Christianity always this sort of caricature of Jews.
Yeah.
Just a note on this, and again, this is just Nietzsche NPC over here at the moment, but I do think he brings up some very interesting points on why you see this phenomenon so much. And it's his general critique of ideology, I guess you could say, and the capacity for us to act rationally. Even though there is the gospel is littered with the irony of the fact that it has been written by Jewish men, Christians can have an authentically anti-Semitic perspective, even though they're Christian, because it's more that their instincts are driving them. Their will is driving them. Like Nick and all them are not theologians. They are sitting in modern America, and they feel instinctively under a existential threat. They feel like the Jews have taken their nation off them, and they're importing all these migrants in, and they're transforming the world, and they're destroying their future and destiny, and they're making all their girls, their potential girls, they're sticking them up on OnlyFans, and this hits them in their soul. They feel intimidated. They feel crushed by this. They feel like they're getting oppressed. They feel like the network of people in power are exactly the people doing this. They feel like they're sadists attacking them, and they explode upon them. They see them as their rivals, as the target, as the people they want to attack. They want to take out of power, and so this is why you get the Christian veneer, I guess you could say, on this, because it's a nice way that we can present our savage instincts to ourselves. Like they're in a war, they see themselves in a tribal war, and it's so fascinating. Again, why Nietzsche points this out, it's so difficult for us to be clear conscience about what we are, and the fact that we want to go in some nasty savage fight for power, a dirty climb to the top so we can be the people in power instead of our rivals. And maybe Nick can be honest about that with himself, or maybe someone pursuing power like Stalin could be honest about that to himself. But the people, the mob, the masses, they cannot digest that type of story, and you need to present it to them in this sort of like, it's almost like you're speaking to a woman. You need to present it in some type of flattering, beautiful way. You need to color it in. And so what did Stalin say? It's like, well, we're all doing this together, comrades, for equality. And then this is the same thing with Christianity. It's like we're doing this for the glory of God. We're doing this is a godly, holy war. And then Christianity has within it the capacity for it to adapt to that anti-Semitism. You can read it in a certain way, block out other things. This is cognitive dissonance 101. And then it works. And then you have this very potent force that has theological reasons to hate the Jews. And then boom, there you go. You've got it all just fits, and your instincts morph it this way. And then this is what's so fascinating. You find an evangelical Southerner, And their instincts, they absolutely adore the Jews. They love the idea of Israel. And so they can take the exact same set of texts and just bend it in such a way that it suits their instincts and their political desires and their hopes. And it's so fascinating watching this stuff. And of course, there are deeper questions about the worldview that the book itself instantiates over this and gets us caught up in this nonsense. But I can really see how the instincts bend this and can give you such diverse responses to reality based on all the same, core texts and constitution.
Yeah, those are good points. Let's talk about Tate a little bit here. So, Steph, were you ever interested in Tate yourself? Did he? Because there's some kind of elective affinities that I can see between the two of you, and you mentioned that some people you knew were inspired by his kind of, go get him, don't let anyone hold you back, injunctions. But what is kind of like your personal relationship with Tate?
Yeah, so I actually found Tate on Twitter about 5 years ago, and I had him on my channel for maybe one of his first interviews on YouTube. It's like famous among the Tate cult, and I haven't had him back on since. But I've been in his circle since then, and I've met an awful lot of people who know him, and I've kind of I've known him, but I'm not in any way associated with him or a friend or anything like that. But I've met him. You
should stress that stuff. You have no association.
I'm kind of glad now. I'm kind of like, whoa, he's getting a lot of heat at the moment, poor dude. But he's in Europe, so Europe's actually a relatively small place, especially when you're on the internet and stuff like this, and I see him very much like Jordan Peterson part 2. I think really he came and he there's a lot of different takes I'd have in him. So one I'd give, for example, is that he's probably one of the first actual super celebrities for the youth that was not propped up by the old world. Take, for example, I think the last super celebrity I can remember in my life who had all my male friends talking about this superhero. It's not like Beyonce or fucking Rihanna or something like this. A really big deal was Eminem. I can't really remember anybody since Eminem that just really took over the world like that. And I was a kid when Eminem was around. And Tate seemed to have that effect. So he was the first celebrity of the internet age, the kind of once in a generation type celebrity by the looks of it. And he's so fascinating because there's just so many extreme polarities that come out. Again, he's like Nick. He's just got this amazingly intense character. He's loved by all the right wingers, but he's a fucking Muslim. It's like, what is going on? This is crazy. And he's a sex trafficker. He runs a webcam studio, and then all the right wing conservatives are like, "Yeah, let's go, man! Muslim webcam studio runner." It's just unbelievable. But
it is truly unbelievable. I mean, even the origins of the alt-right as a movement, I think it's, it cannot be separated from Trump. There's no question about it. But I remember the 2015 refugee crisis in Europe, which of course has settled down as time goes on. But there was that just existential energy to it all, that you just had the images of it, the thought of it was just knocking all these people off the fence. And these same people are endorsing someone who is converted to Islam and who is, at the very least, recklessly banging all these white women, and who is, in all likelihood or allegedly, a pimp of some kind, whether actual pimp or a OnlyFans pimp or whatever that means. But he is a kind of representation of everything that they claim to fear. And the kind of dialectical flip that they underwent to support this man really is beyond belief. It's like the most implausible thing is what actually happened. I can't.
Ben, this is all clean clothes. Did you?
What?
Yeah, that was just someone who actually accidentally had their mic on.
Oh, okay.
But I think there's so, again, man, we could talk about this, man, for hours. So it's the same way as I see, I would say, liberals fetishize 50 Cent. This thug who sold drugs his whole life and shot people, and then he gets propped up as this badass rapper. There's this sort of fetishization of the dangerous man, the noble savage, I guess you could say, maybe in some sense, or that's not necessarily the right metaphor, but there's something brutal about him. And that's what was attractive about Tate, because I remember when I found him, I was like, he was being honest, and he was presenting himself as the the bad guy. You know, he was coming and saying like, I'm here and I'm going to tell you how the world actually works. I'm not going to lie to you. There's going to be no veneer. I exploit women. He would say it over and over again at the internet. And I'm like, he's obviously come back to bite him in the ass now. But he's like, I get women and I tell them I love them. And then that we hang out and then we go out and then I say, hey, why don't you try webcam and all this? And that's made me a millionaire. And I drive in this fast car and you're a fucking dork. You're a loser. You pay taxes. I don't pay taxes. I have all these international companies. I have 12 passports. If they want to get me to pay taxes, they can't do it. But you don't. You pay taxes. Your wife won't suck your dick. You're below me. I'm better than you because I'm nasty and I'm mean. I remember he had some Twitter post where he goes, sin pays. I'm opening casinos. Sin pays. He's just like publishing this stuff. And it's so fascinating because it's like a Roman trapped in the falling Roman Empire, feeling castrated by the giant bureaucracy, watching this giant Christian movement show up and just eradicate all the old pagan gods. And then you have like Attila the Hun on the outside just flexing and saying like, you stupid dork loser Roman, look how much better I am than you. Look how free I am. You live within the confines of your stupid falling empire. I'm a winner. And I'm a winner because I'm bad, because I'm willing to hurt people, because I'm willing to do dangerous things, or maybe a barbarian at the gate type character. And he really brought that energy. And there is a truth to that. There's like a sort of high testosterone, savage reality of nature in that a lot of people responded to very heavily. And back when Tate was talking like that, he was being much more honest. His rhetoric now is completely morphed into a PR thing because he's obviously trying to save his ass from criminal charges. But now it's all about like men's mental health and all this stuff. But just before that happened, maybe a year and a half ago, like listening to him was this type of extreme energy. And I think it's like a Jungian shadow for the Western sort of middle class guy who has never felt power in his life, and then he has this character who's just like a parody of it, like a pure expression of Breaking Bad, of being evil, of all these type of things, and it's incredibly attractive to people. And he's obviously very funny as well. Like he's very polarizing and hilarious, and he tells really good stories. And so for this reason, he captivated so many people. Like again, like I found him hilarious. I really like talking to him. He's genuinely insightful as well. He's not an idiot. And I kind of got over him then after a while. Like I obviously would sit down and listen to the odd thing about him because again, he's just very, very good at speaking. But my friends then, in about last year or so, every single one of them just got obsessed with him. They would like literally come in and show me pictures. They show me the interview with him. He's like, "Man, bro, you're famous." I was like, "Jesus Christ, lads, what is going on?" And they loved him. They fell head over heels with him. I met kids, man, like 14-year-old kids that would recognize me on the street because of stuff like this. And they're like, "You're the guy who talked to Tate." I'm like, "What the fuck?" I could barely even look like that guy anymore. I never it's maybe since Jordan Peterson, but even that he's gone beyond Jordan Peterson. He had such an effect on the male coefficient of people, and it's probably because he has, in some sense, maybe a Nietzschean trait. He's careless, mocking, forceful, and he has the kind of wisdom that you get from being a sadist who assaults reality and pushes its boundaries and sees what happens when he gets bit in return. So
yeah,
he very, very, very polarizing character, but without doubt.
And don't you think it's interesting that all of these figures that we've been talking about, Nick, Jordan Peterson, Tate, they ultimately end up in pushing people towards monotheism or Abrahamic religions. Like, isn't it like, for instance, and I've even heard like Marianne Williamson, who, I kind of like her, to be honest, but she's super goofy, like mystical self-help guru,
but that one, yeah, man, she's great. I love her.
Yeah, I do I have a soft spot for her. But she was like, I used to really appreciate Jordan Peterson, and he would talk about Jung and Nietzsche and myth, and she was like, I don't know where he's gone. He's become a kind of political hack, but he's also become a promoter of Christianity, and from someone who was an atheist. And it's very fascinating. I just hopped on a space 2 nights ago, and there was this utterly tedious and boring Catholic. I actually got off. I could not take her nonsense anymore, but she was kind of talking about how Jordan Peterson's about to convert to Catholicism, and it actually seemed quite plausible. And she would know. She works for the Daily Wire. But anyway, They do that. Tate says that, well, Christianity is a little bit weak. You've got to go for the harder Islam. And also there's no racism is impossible with Islam because we're all brothers fighting against degeneracy or something like that. And and Nick will say the same thing. And they often have a similar justification for it as well, which is that I didn't always believe in the devil, but now I do. And the left is the devil, effectively. So it's, liberals used to just want to give you healthcare or something, but now they want to castrate children and promote all sorts of crazy degeneracy. And so they're kind of like passively, at least the way they justify it, they're passively aggressively justifying their religion. It's not even about, myself, I come from a Protestant background. I mean, I do take that seriously. I'm not a Christian, obviously, but I do take what they say seriously. You're born in sin. The way out is to put your faith in Jesus, take that kind of leap of faith, and then you will have an afterlife. And it kind of doesn't matter. You can't work it off, or you can't give to charity. It's actually a kind of radical, intentional act that you engage in. Obviously, this is a Protestant perspective on matters. They don't really justify it in that way. They don't really talk about how you deserve the wrath of God and Jesus can let you off. It's instead a kind of like Manichaean, the left is evil. And you'll see this like late night tweets from Jordan Peterson in all caps, where he seems kind of like a maniac, to be honest. Like, you sons of bitches are doing it again. Until I castrate myself, you won't be happy. I mean, just kind of unhinged nonsense on some level. I mean, I'll grant them, I don't like the trans stuff either. I mean, don't get me wrong here, but like there's a way of reacting to it that is just clearly unhinged. And so it's like where Christianity is having a revival on the right. I mean, I think that's totally clear. And we're not winning this battle of hearts and minds, I'm afraid to say. But Christianity is having a revival on the right, but it's a kind of Manichaean version. Anyway, what do you think about that? Do you think I'm right about that in terms of how they justify it?
Man, there's so many things you brought up, and I think I'd love, man. There's so much to dive into here because I think it is actually fascinating. Like Tate as a case study is something else, and you even brought up Jordan Peterson. Him alone is just so fascinating. And then how those two interact, because they basically have the same audience. They just don't realize it. And they just talk to the audience in different ways. Jordan Peterson's like the father at home. Like, you're the middle class kid and you're growing up in this modern world and you feel disenfranchised. And, I'm getting all this propaganda, the men are evil and all this. And Jordan Peterson's like your at home dad. And then Tate's like the bad brother who wants to inoculate you in a gang down the road or something like this. And they're kind of pulling you both ways.
He seems to have slept with Jordan Peterson's daughter, if to boot. I mean, it goes so deep. Yeah, like
what the hell? Like, it's like a novel or something. You're like, what is going on here? Like, how did those two end up? I couldn't believe it when you see that stuff and the picture as well. Jesus Christ!
Oh yeah.
I think the problem, especially like we could say little groups of us have, is that we're abstract thinkers. Like we're ideological. We sit down again. We brought this up earlier. Like we would sit down and we'd read the Bible and we'd be like, wait a second, like Yahweh's the Jewish God. like the way he's getting mad at Jews. Like, lads, come on, wait a second. This book kind of tells you a lot. Like Adam for no more news is the sort of the same. He's sitting down there with all these Christians and he's saying to them, like, don't you realize how ironic what you're doing is? It doesn't make any sense at all. And they're all literally like, I hate you. I don't care if it makes sense or not. You're a demon. Get away from me. Don't tell me about this stuff, because people aren't abstract. Like, people don't deal with the future. They don't deal with abstractions. People are very grounded in what they can see with their eyes. They observe to their detriment in some sense, and also something that we have to be fatalistic about. And like Nick and Tate, a huge amount of these religious choices are come actually from the sexual problem, and it comes from the problem of like sexual relations nowadays. Like the incels react actually quite understandably against the OnlyFans girl, like the average girl that goes on Fresh and Fit, that TV show or that Rumble show, whatever it is.
Yeah.
She's a girl from Miami. She's slept with 120 men. And she has an OnlyFans that she sells naked pictures of herself up on the internet. And this is the woman has polarized to this point of sort of looseness, if you will, that it's quite extreme. And so you get the opposite extreme in response to this. Like you have a young man who's struggling to find a girlfriend, and this kind of turns him off, and he needs to create an identity that rebels against this stuff. And so Tate was essentially an expression of those trends that led to women becoming like this. You know, he was an expression of the pickup artist or the pimp. And the most extreme expression of it, like he would sort of show up and say, you middle class Christian man gets divorce raped and exploited by a woman while she cheats on you. I instead take the same woman, stick her on OnlyFans and exploit her. He's like the opposite of the same trend. And his experience of life is that he's not an abstract guy at all. Like he sits down and he looks at what's going on around him, and he sees these women in these clubs, and he sees this, and he participates in that, and he aims to win. And then over time, as he started to get super popular, the pandemic really changed a lot, because that's when all this stuff became really extreme. The OnlyFans thing started to explode. A lot of men in the West started to turn around and be like, what the fuck is going on, man? Like women are like, I want a wife, man. And I don't want a girl. I don't want, what was that Adam 22 guy who just got married and then let his girl get like rattled by some black dude in a porno?
Well, he did marry a porn star. So I mean,
no, see, this is
what he was getting into. Yeah, I agree.
He married her, but she had never done a male scene before. She was a lesbian porn star.
Oh,
and that was her first ever.
I didn't know that aspect. Okay.
And that's crazy. Like, what is going on with this? And that's very extreme. And obviously there's a huge audience of people, like, you know, who find that hilarious and find that funny, and are like, yeah, you stop being uptight about it, whatever, it's no big deal. But there's obviously a huge reaction to this. And so all these people see this stuff, and they're not abstract. They're not going to sit down and try to say, all right, let's get into the deep theology here and figure out what we do about this stuff. They're going to look at the existing powerful institutions that could pose some type of resistance to it. And so most people in the West look to Christianity because it's the last thing they can remember. It's the obvious thing that resists this. The Christian conservative that says that you must get married and it's a sin to cheat on your wife and get divorced. Like, that's the simplest, obvious answer to them. And of course, Tate goes to Islam because Tate is a bit more able to think abstractly, and he's a bit more ballsy, and it also kind of suits him that he can move all his assets to Dubai. And so he sits down and he says, all right, I'm going to take this because this is a way firmer answer to all this stuff that's going on. Like, this gives me the ability to, like, literally just turn around to women and say, you cannot have freedom anymore because you can't be trusted with it. And it makes sense to him. It also allows him to express his instincts. Like, he's a man. He's full of this desire to fuck lots of women. And he comes across Islam, which says you can have 4 wives. That's actually surprisingly interesting. Like, even Nietzsche himself pointed out that Christianity is full of priests. Islam is something that understands itself as dealing with men.
Yeah.
Actually, Nietzsche had some great things to say about Islam that Tate ironically reflects in many of the ways that he talks about it. He says, you know, it's a more manly religion. It's got all these type of things. It's got a more refined taste. And Nietzsche even says these words, and you hear it coming out of Andrew Tate's mouth. You're like, what the fuck is going on here? So I think that's a really important thing to get clear, is that this is not ideological. It's not Tate is not whipping open the Quran and reading this stuff. Like, he's just looking and seeing. He goes to Dubai, he notices everybody has a family, and he says, all right, that religion works. And he comes back here, and you have all these conservatives, you know, whining and bitching and moaning on Twitter, while there's like a transgender priest, you know, psyoping an entire church and telling them, you're like, you know, I'm going to cut your kids' dick. And it's like, look, these people don't have any control over their religion. This religion is gone. And I think an awful lot of the Christians in the West are like idealistic. I actually think this is a fascinating thing about Christianity, is that it is clearly losing. It's clearly getting humiliated. It's clearly at its lowest point it's ever been. But it's got this ability to inspire a future, a redemption. And so I speak to loads of conservative Christians, and like, you know, they kind of hate me and love me because I'm like talking about Nietzsche all the time. But they have this belief that they're going to get through this, and then the church is going to rise again, and it's going to be this like new golden age and stuff like this, because that's what they have to hope for, because they can't accept reality. They have to hope for a future. And that's really an interesting side of Christianity that I don't think something like Islam has at all. So I've said a lot of stuff there. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, you can jump in, Mark, if you have some comments on this.
Yeah, you know, I was I was actually interested to know if anyone here had watched the interview that Tate had with Tucker. It was my intention to watch it. I actually just didn't get a chance to watch it.
I watched it.
Yeah, did you watch it? So, and I'll let you talk about it then. But I just find it interesting that he is being platformed by the right. Now, I'm sure Tucker asked him some, maybe he wasn't throwing him softballs the whole time, but it seemed like it was generally a friendly interview.
He was throwing him softballs the whole time.
All right, yeah,
he was putting the ball in the
Uber...
tee basically and letting him hit it. It was
all right, so
not serious.
Both of you guys have seen the interview.
Yeah.
I think we should, because that to me is a lot of these things we've already discussed on other shows. The question of Islam, and I think that we've discussed Tate before as well. Nietzsche makes this line. I've said this in other shows, but Nietzsche sort of makes this prediction that we can imagine at some point that the criminal will be held as the highest type, right?
Yeah.
and we've actually seen this in Hollywood, for example, where maybe the most popular film of all time is Godfather, right? We see it in rap music where the pimp becomes a kind of ideal or archetype that's promoted, right? And so Nietzsche, this is something that Nietzsche kind of anticipated or predicted, that at some point the criminal will become the highest type. And I think that we see that with Tate as well. I think that the observations that Steph is making about Islam are interesting and correct. And Nietzsche does say some flattering things about Islam, primarily to, as he does often, set up a kind of foil, I would argue, for Christianity, or to show how it is superior to Christianity, if not ideal, if not something he's advocating for, it's superior to Christianity. Tate is also a non-white too, so I think that is, or he's a octoroon. I don't know. Richard knows
his father's black, his mother is white. His father, ironically, was the chess grandmaster or something. So he's a very
he's half black though. I mean, he seems like he's a little less than.
His father's half black.
Okay, his father's half black.
So he's a quarter black, right? So a quadroon, I guess he would say. But he, so I think that this is probably one of the reasons that he's drawn to Islam as well, because it is ultimately a non-white religion. So I mean, I was talking to Richard earlier too. He said, I think that there is a lot of evidence too, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, and this is something I put in the book, is that I mean, the most obvious example of this in Christianity, of course, is Mary Magdalene, right? Essentially, the consort of Jesus is a prostitute, and he's also he's descended from a single mother, right? And in Joseph, there's a weird sort of cuckoldry dynamic sort of implied there as well. But that Jesus is among the rabble, ostensibly in the Gospels, and including among prostitutes who are suggestively washing his feet and pouring vials of perfume on his head. And all of these have a kind of symbolic suggestiveness to them, which is definitely the case. And we're talking about parables here that are symbolically encoded. And there are references to earlier similar, parables, symbol-laden parables that appear in the Hebrew Bible, for example, making similar references, with symbols like jars and wells and all kinds of like sort of suggestive little things that are in there. But the argument I make is that prostitution, like I think that there is a kind of innuendo in when we're talking about Elisha and Elijah, who are these avatars or precedents of Jesus. There's an insinuation there that prostitution is going on, and there are a couple of parables that point to that. But the most obvious example of that would be this sort of consort that Jesus has, who's a kind of equivalent to Mary, or rather Mary, her name is Mary, but she's kind of an equivalent to Venus, right? And this is something actually that Nietzsche sort of points out casually, is that the story of Adonis and Venus, Jesus and Mary is basically, that's one of the kind of important inspirations on Christianity. right? And there, the cult of Adonis is more explicitly a sort of cult where we find promiscuous women who are following the procession of Adonis, and prostitutes. It's a cult of prostitutes. So these are some of the things that are kind of making the insinuations, but there are clearer examples in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But that basically Jesus is in an environment where he's hanging out with these kind of like scum, ultimately, right? Like he's hanging out with scum is just too hard a word, but he's hanging out with guys who are not, they're not the Pharisees. They're not people they're sort of the lower rung of the Jews, and they're among prostitutes as well, with Mary Magdalene being an example. So I think Tate, and a guy like Tate, becomes a sort of weird, I don't know, it feels like a kind of revelation of Abrahamism, where these things have always been, part of the early formation of the cult, and these symbols have always been in the Abrahamic religion. I mean, we understand that, for example, Jesus is descended of two prostitutes, Tamar, who is the wife of Judah. So most of Judaism, or most of the Jews, are descended also of a prostitute, Tamar, and Rabbah is another prostitute that's in the sort of the family tree. I think this is according to Matthew. There's a genealogy tracing Jesus's, lineage back to the house of Judah, house of David. So this is part of it's, in the thing that's remarkable about this. I mean, we can say, well, there's something kind of real and human about the fact that there are sort of prostitutes, or like criminals or thieves or bad people in someone's family tree. Like that can kind of be forgiven, I guess, right? I mean, no one has this is something Nietzsche points out as well. I mean, all of us are not kind of strictly descended from, the kings or noble class. There probably are some bad apples even in our family tree. Though we probably, likely the people on the call probably have relatively good family trees. So, and I think that's the case here. But no one's perfect, of course. So we can look at that and be like, okay, well, there's something that makes something human about Jesus. The fact that he's descended from these prostitutes, to use a kind of more obvious and admitted example that doesn't delve into the esotericism. But when we understand it to be a kind of myth, to be mythology, right? Because it evidently is that. I mean, we're seeing a parable that's based, not only is the New Testament based on, characters that are appearing in the Hebrew Bible, like Elisha or Elijah, it's also based on Adonis and Bacchus and these pagan characters. We see all these sort of influences creating this myth. So if it's a myth, and we accept that it is a myth, why does Judah have a whore as his wife that's creating the Jews, right? Wouldn't they think, well, let's not have a prostitute, right? And the question with Tamar is Tamar, I think might be the pronunciation. Tamar is a little more complex than that, right? So she disguises herself as a prostitute. She puts on the veil, but she's in a whorehouse when they have their children. But these are all, if we understand that it's fabricated and you're creating a myth, why wouldn't you make your characters very noble? And right. In prostitution is just the kind of tip of the iceberg. Why is Jacob a thief? Why is Jacob this, someone trying to like deceive people and steal their birthright and steal their sheep and this sort of thing? Why does Judah sell his brother Joseph to slavers, and they bring him to Egypt? Why do you have these crooks in your family tree? Now, again, it's one thing if we're talking about a real history here, right? If we're talking about a real history here, fine. No one's perfect. Everyone's got bad apples in their family tree. But if we're talking about an invented myth that's a parable that contains parables, and it is not only describing ancestors or describing a type, it's seeking to inspire or continue a type. Why are these your models, right? But when I look at a guy like, so that's why when I look at, to bring a long story back to its origin, that's why when I look at a guy like Tate, and we see forms of Abrahamism, next to a guy who's a pimp, with a harem, it's not as sort of like incongruent as you would think, right? Because that's part of the whole DNA of Abrahamism. That's the end of my comment.
That's all very good. I mean, this fundamentally derives from the fact that Jesus is Dionysus. We are looking.
It's a sublimated Dionysus.
Yeah, we're looking at a Dionysian cult at its source code level, and that doesn't mean to say that there aren't millions of Southern Christians or Irish Catholics or something who are kind of prudes at worst and at best kind of family oriented, and let's not misrepresent the adherents, but let's properly represent what this thing is at its very origin, and that is a Dionysian cult. I mean, even the accusations against it, we know so little about the ancient world. Modern history, we're like overwhelmed with data and pop culture, detritus, etc. The ancient world, you have to find things, but it is very curious that early Christians were accused of this kind of behavior, granted by pagan adversaries who didn't have their best interest at heart. But these accusations of orgies, bloodletting, all sorts of things, they might very well have not been true and just been slander, but it maybe they were kind of unconsciously true. They were seeing what they were seeing. They were seeing a Dionysian cult emerge in Rome.
Yeah, as far as those who can know, as far as the pagan accusations of an orgy cult and this sort of thing, maybe some of that went on. I mean, but to your point, I would say that's sort of encoded in the symbol language and in the parables that are in Christianity. Again, Jesus is Adonis, Mary is Venus, Jesus is also Bacchus, right? So it's there.
Yeah,
she's a prostitute. There's these parables where they're talking about like selling jars of oil, which appear to be references to like pimping out women, in Alicia, and they're reoccurring. These references are reoccurring throughout the whole biblical work. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Just some thoughts on, all right, expanding on the Tate phenomenon, related somewhat to what you're saying, but I think there might be maybe a bit of a mistake thinking that the Abrahamic myths can have this much of an influence on why these people are making these decisions. I think it can certainly accept Tate as he is, but I'm not sure if it's like guiding his actions. I really think he went to Islam because it suited his instincts, not the other way around. You know what I mean? Like, it's
I wasn't necessarily saying that. I was just saying that it's not incongruent in the sense that it's like, there is a kind of body origin to Islam. So for us to be like, wait, to Islam because it's an Abrahamic faith, and then Islam's got its own symbolism. It's descending from that sort of body tree, we can say, but it has its own also body symbolism in a lot of ways. So it's not it's not what Christians imagine. Like, I think that the Christian perception of this root, whether it's the New Testament even or the Hebrew Bible, they have this kind of they don't even know what they're looking at, and they refuse to look at it honestly. So anyways, please.
Yeah, like, it's again just coming back to that Nietzschean idea. I think about it so much. The use your illusion type idea, the art, the delusion, the dream must serve life, and so the truth is like out the window for an awful lot of this stuff. It's not what matters at all. And I think maybe to broadly cover the whole phenomenon here, I empathize, I try to imagine I'm a young 14-year-old dude, mixed race, live in England, or maybe like a young middle-class white guy in America or something like this. And I I'm looking for somebody to show me how to live. It reminds me of that song by Soundgarden where Chris Cornell is like screaming, "Show me how to live." And it's like that's the ask, you know. You're a young dude and you're going out into the world and you're saying to yourself, like, what am I? Who am I? How do I become what I am, as Nietzsche might say? How do I live? Show me how to live. What's the way? Give me a model that I can express myself as. And like, what are you if you're a man? Well, you're obviously full of testosterone. You're full of a set of instincts that are quite unique towards masculinity. And so we come up with this abstract concept of masculinity, which is representative of how a male of the species expresses his instincts, expresses his desires. And these usually formulate as like desire to breed, desire to impregnate, desire to set boundaries, desire to fight, desire to get status and respect so that you can achieve all these other things. And our instincts torture us when you're a young man and you can't express those instincts, when you feel that you can't get the girl you want, you feel like you can't assert your boundaries because you're not brave enough or strong enough. You feel bad about that stuff. You feel castrated, you feel cuckolded, you feel pathetic, you feel depressed, you feel down. And so loads of young men across the world are wrestling with their instincts right now. And like Tate's not a unique phenomenon. You can go up and look at a guy called Hamza. He's one of the bigger self-improvement guys for the Zoomers, and he's a mixed race from England. And he might not even be mixed race. He might be entirely Pakistani or something like this. He's huge, absolutely huge, with a strong English accent, kind of a representation of what England will be now in the next 30 years or so. And he has a huge following. And he talks about self-improvement. He talks about lifting weights. It's like the opposite of Nick Fuentes, and I guess in some interesting way. But he shows people a model of masculinity. He's like the cool friend, the nice older brother or something like this. And young dudes love him. And they love him because they can listen to him, and he gives them, he's like, this is how you talk to girls. This is how you go and lift weights at the gym. This is how you act around people. This is how you dress. There's this other dude from England who does the same thing, CEO of Testosterone. And he's the same thing. He's telling people like how to dress and all these types of things. And that's a pretty significant thing. Like a lot of people get seduced by that because it gives them a path. And this way forward in the world is a big deal. I was talking about it with Nick earlier. Like some people might reject that more self-improvement thing because they think it's low resolution or something like this, and perhaps it is. And then he provides them a way, and he says, sacrifice everything towards an ideal. Of course, the ideal is Christ, but this is also an expression of our instincts towards reaching the most transformative amount of political power we possibly could. And so he's providing people a way. And he's like, be like me. Don't be afraid to get rid of girls or even risk becoming an incel. Go all in this political game. Let's go for something big. Nothing else has any meaning. This is the way. And he points people in that direction. Jordan Peterson, the whole reason why he's going towards Catholicism is because Jung actually spoke about this. Jung said, Jung coming from a Protestant background, said Catholicism is the only safe thing that a European can attach themselves to in this time of crisis, or else they'll get pulled off towards some type of ideology that they have to watch out for. And I think Jordan Peterson's just following along with that. And Catholicism, in some sense, is fundamentally does this idea of show me how to live by a Platonic elite who live in Rome, who organized the totality of the laity's life by giving them a clear model of how to live. They give them everything. They give them free therapy in confession. They give them like the archetypal transformative experiences of marriage, communion, baptism, welcome to the community. They have the church. You visit the church all the time. Like Catholicism's absolutely fucking genius. And what's most genius about it is that it's unideological. You don't even read the book that you apparently believe in, because they so intuitively understood what they were doing. Those goddamn rascal Italians, they actually got it. Like, and they formed the philosopher king elite, and then they took away the intellectual stuff from the laities and just made them live a normal life. They showed them how to live, type thing. And this is also why people, I think, are going towards Islam so much. And I see a lot, like Tate's not the first. I actually met lots of highly masculine men before Tate that were converting to Islam. Like they'd be like Scottish and stuff like this. And you're like, what the fuck? You dude, you're like whiter than me and you're going towards Islam. And there's something simple, intolerant, binary, and affirmative of male instincts that people like in Islam, as I said. And I think an awful lot of the problem for Nietzscheans, or you could say pagans or whatever, is that we're way too ideological and abstract. Like we don't have a way for people. Like we don't have this clear idea of like, you're dealing with a problem of sexuality. You're dealing with a problem of identity, of expressing these fundamental instincts. People don't necessarily want to understand the nuance of these things. They want simply a way. And all these monotheistic religions have this way clearly laid out for people. Islam is clear. It is a very, very clear presentation. And there's a sophistication actually in its clarity as well that's important to keep in mind. And so someone like Tay, and as I said, Nick, he shows up and he just gives people a way to deal with modernity when they're not getting any better answer from their priest or the pastor or the conservative influencer. None of those people tell a young man what you should do. They're like, oh, go vote for Donald Trump. And everybody believes that Donald Trump the election was fake or something like this. And so or like, go vote for Joe Biden or whatever it is. But nobody like actually commits to this. And then Tate comes along and says, look, forget about all that stuff. You've got to make yourself as rich as possible to be able to deal with this reality. Go and buy Hustlers University to do this. And it almost sounds like a ruse that must be obvious to people, but he's just able to drill that home with enough force and enough clarity and enough sincerity about men's instincts and their insecurities that it just answers something for them. And he presents this idea of this internationalist, globalized individual with like 50 passports who travels all around the world. It's almost like some type of like neo-Judaism or something like this, where you're like an international character and you have no home and you're just like seeking out ways that you can, gather wealth for yourself and make yourself anti-fragile and powerful because you can't trust any native governments or something like that. It's quite interesting to see this pop up as his prescriptions. So I think that's a very important concept to make all this clear to people. And I've had enough of a rant there and I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Does anyone in the crowd want to ask a question or raise an issue that they find important? You can just raise your hand and I'll call on you.
I joined the call a little late, Richard. Good afternoon, by the way.
Yes, good afternoon in Italia. Or good morning.
Well, no,
right?
good evening.
Oh, no, good evening. Excuse me. I always mix this. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Anyone can jump in. Just go ahead. All right.
Hey, Richard. I wanted to make a comment about earlier when you guys were going over how even though Christianity is at its weakest point, it seems to have this kind of last wind.
Yeah.
And what and this is kind of a point you guys have made a lot, but I do think it's interesting how the Christians actually seem to love like them being this like persecuted underdog. It goes back to their whole mythos and what you guys point out a lot is like you see like similarities between that and liberalism loving like they love to be oppressed. It's like that's how they show their virtue. And in many ways, like I think Christianity, certainly Protestantism, feels most at home with itself when it is kind of persecuted.
Yeah, definitely. I would take this a little further. I've recently been reading on Joachim of Florence. Have you ever encountered? Do you know who I'm speaking of? Steph?
No.
Yeah, I do actually. Jung was big into him. Jung would talk about him an awful lot. Is the guy about the Holy Spirit and the era of the Holy Spirit and stuff like that. It's a very fascinating man.
Exactly. I mean, it goes back. It goes back 1,000 years, and actually, it's an interesting period. That not all of Joachim has been translated, but there are many scholars who have, written about him. So I think you can get a good idea of who he was. He's a monk, Catholic monk. Obviously, there is there are these. I'm probably misstating some things here, but there are these interesting controversies involving the Franciscan monks who were offering an authentic but maybe subversive vision of Christianity, and that is poverty and the holiness of every individual person, you could say. But this goes against, obviously, the Catholic Church, which collected immense amounts of wealth. And in fact, even, Jesus's injunctions towards, poverty, your best life is not now, et cetera, almost helped with fundraising in the sense that you could guilt trip a rich merchant into giving the church all of his money, and he would feel so great about himself, and the church would accumulate all of this. But anyway, he also lived in a time in these disputes between the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II who was these all of these controversies are so kind of complicated. I'm not even sure I'm stating them correctly, but he was effectively declared the Antichrist at one point by the Pope, even though he was actually crusading himself. And a lot of these were power plays. The Catholic Church was, needless to say, at a different state. But what I'm getting at is that there's a certain kind of anxiety about the time 1,000 years ago, more or less, of, is there an Antichrist German rising? Is the church kind of wrong? Is there another way that we can fulfill Christ's message? And yeah, I mean, he codified this in I think a very helpful way at the very least. And I think he might have actually had this profound insight into the past 3,000 years of history. So the millennium history of the Old Testament or the Jews. Now, Mark and I might believe that the Old Testament's written a lot later, but it claims that it's kind of covering this millennium that was the era of the Father, and it was the era of absolute authority to the point of terror and subservience to the Father. And then Joachim felt that he had lived through 1,000 years era of the Son. And that is this man who was God, but who redeemed us from all that. We no longer had to suffer God's wrath, his just punishment for our sins. We no longer had to see him as an absolute authority as well. We could be redeemed from that world of the Father through Jesus. So this was the era of the Son. And he was pushing or kind of announcing a new period of the era of the Holy Spirit, where, and I think this does actually have a lot of elective affinities or similarities with Protestantism, in the sense that you no longer, at least this was implied, and this is why I think his vision was so dangerous, is that you no longer need the mediation of the church to redeem you. In fact, you can be inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is God. As we know, he was a Trinitarian, as all Christians were and are. And so you no longer need that mediation, but you can engage in the Holy Spirit with your fellow man. And so there's a kind of Franciscan quality to it. There's a certain Protestant quality to it. There's also a certain liberal quality to it. I mean, I think that all of us here recognize that liberals are fundamentally Christians, that their worldview of uplift to the poor, of recognizing human rights and the sacredness of the individual and so on, this is warmed over Christianity, I guess you could say, a little bit polemically, but it is a kind of fulfillment of Christianity. I mean, in some ways, I mean, this is something that Hegel alluded to, but in some ways, God is dead. That it's a very, and Hegel actually said that before Nietzsche, interestingly, but God is dead is a very interesting and complicated and kind of ironic statement. And obviously God is dead and he rose again. I mean, that's the nature of him. He is not an eternal God like what was accepted by most people at the time. But also, Jesus failed. I mean, he was failed and mocked as the King of the Jews when he was crucified. And he was crucified in the most just absolutely, I mean, he was killed in the most absolutely humiliating, disgusting manner imaginable. He was given the treatment of a slave or a criminal or an insurrectionist or what have you. And he died in the sense that there is a element of failure to his life. But what comes after Christ is that we must be inspired by the Holy Spirit and love one another. That is engage in his new covenant, effectively, which he announced at the Last Supper, which is very simple, which is love your fellow man. You know, and you can even see this in politics. I mean, what is Plato trying to get at with the Republic, other than it's not about, you know, what the good is, or the ideal of the good is not about harming your enemies and helping your friends. It's about something higher and bigger than that. And Jesus put this into quotidian language of go out there and love one another. And what is liberalism outside of that? What is even like German idealism on some level? I mean, Kant spent thousands of pages rationally justifying that basic injunction, the golden rule, or love, you know, love. And what is liberalism, or even modernity, without a kind of inner theology? So we like to think of modernity as, oh, we've given up on religion, the clerics, you know, we screw them. We don't need to listen to some priest tell us stuff. We can do this on our own. And there is a kind of, you know, radical liberationist, or you could say libidinal quality to modernism, you know, free love and free sex and do what you want or gain power and money. I get it. But there's a kind of inner theology to modernity that justifies it. And that inner theology is Christianity, fundamentally. And so might Joachim have actually been accurate in perceiving this? Like, the beginning of the modern age is an age of the Holy Spirit. We no longer need to blindly obey the Father, you know, under the threat that he might kill us if we do otherwise, or punish us in some ways. And we, in a way, also no longer need the redemption of the Son. That was a millennium period where, you know, when you think about the Dark Ages, I mean, your life for a peasant or a noble, what was about life after death? It was about living, thinking about how you were behaving in this world and how that would lead you to a higher realm. And we're kind of beyond that at some point, and we're entering a new age of loving one another, taking care of one another, recognizing every human being as a sacred individual. And so I think Joachim was correct. Actually, I think he perceived some deep embedded ideology, if that's the right word, that is motivating mankind. And I think where we are now, where, you know, liberalism has kind of lost its utopia or its endpoint or telos or whatever you want to call it. And it's just kind of like hovering around ideas like equality and equity and democracy and human rights and self-expression and all that kind of stuff. And I think what we might even be seeing in this era is a kind of reaction, maybe of the Father or the Son. You know, it's a reaction of Christ is King, etc. He's your Redeemer, your Messiah, but also a kind of obey the Father. This, you know, however stupid, you know, Fuentes and Tate and Peter said, however stupid a lot of this stuff is, it's still kind of like calling you back to that more primal way of being. And that's why it's attractive. And but I think there's also a kind of question, like I don't think that type of mentality is ultimately going to win out. So there's this kind of question of where are we going from here? There's 1,000 years that distances us from Joachim. There's 1,000 years that distance Joachim from Christ. And what is this next stage? Like, is there another 1,000 years beyond Christianity? And I think Nietzsche didn't have a definitive answer for that, but I do think that is what he is fundamentally discussing. You know, this we've lived through the kind of consequences of Christ and the Middle Ages, and we have a chance to experience a new type of being and a new type of thinking. And in fact, some of these old things might need to be raised to the ground. You might have to push something off the ledge if you see that it's falling. But there is some kind of hope that's unstated. It's the child. It's this innocent and kind of uncomplicated and unburdened person who can make the world anew through a certain kind of playfulness. Like I think there is a kind of openness to where these are, because all of these institutions and ways of thinking, they're actually very old. You know, Christianity, liberalism, modernity, these things have been played out. And they can't even they struggle to even justify themselves. And so I think there's, on the one hand, I think there's kind of two forces. There's like an openness to something new, and on the other hand, there's this reactionary, cornered animal, injured beast that is lashing out, that is offering us that kind of temptation to return to the Father. And so I think the way I've been thinking about a lot of this the last few weeks, but I think Joachim actually really did nail it. I think he understood a kind of essential quality to thinking and ideology that actually is historical and that develops. But
Richard, you have to read Ion, the Phenomenology of the Self by Carl Jung, because it's actually amazing how much the shape of the ideas you're presenting up there are literally what Jung derived out of this. So Jung, if I have a moment, I don't know, does anybody else want to speak? But I can.
Go for it.
This is going to be a little bit of a long one, but this is the thesis out of Ion. Now, here's an interesting little fact. But Jordan Peterson said Ion is the scariest book he's ever read. So I don't know. He's like, he gets scared about a lot of things. So I'm not too sure if that's a big deal. But
he was crying just all the time while reading it. Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. But inside Ion, Jung makes a very fascinating thesis. Now, in order to comprehend the thesis, we have to think on first principles of what Jung was always talking about. So Jung was always banging on about us having this unconscious, our conscious ego, ourselves. We are in relationship to some other force inside of our heads. At that time, that was quite disproven. And obviously it's not perfect because he's using language that's very speculative. But I think I was here before, I was talking about like the right hemisphere, for example. Yeah. Like we do have an obvious part of our brain that has been neuroscientifically proven to be separate and having a monumental influence on how we think, maybe even a leading role. And our conscious left hemisphere might even be the submissive role inside of our own heads, which is freaky enough when you think about it. And so when you look at the way Jung characterizes the ego, the unconscious, he presents it very much this way. He presents it as there's this entity, this living thing inside of your brain that we call the unconscious, that is able to send you symbols, that's able to talk to you, but it doesn't talk to you using language. It talks to you using symbols. It talks to you using emotions, dreams, intuitions, even visions at times. And this is, again, like all very close to what we understand as the right hemisphere doing, but we'll just go with this idea for now. Now, Jung does this study. Jung was like absolute spurg, loved symbolism, loved looking at all these type of things, incredibly literate man as well. And he does this long study back for Christianity, because he was struggling with Christianity himself. And he was trying to figure out why everybody just started to believe in Christianity back then. And so he looks at all the symbols going on at the time, and he comes up with this thesis. Again, you might find it a little bit wacky, that the unconscious chose Christianity back in the day, that there was this giant swirling unconscious, collective unconscious, he used to call this as well, but you can think of everybody's unconscious brain or right brain or symbolic brain or dream brain, whatever you want to say it. We're pregnant for this symbol, this character called the Messiah. They were waiting for this in the Middle East. And all sorts of these symbols began to show up at the time, such as the fish. This was a big one. This is famously, the Christians actually didn't originally draw a cross. They used to draw the fish on the floor. Right. And this was a big one for them. And there was all these ideas of like, I will become fisher of men. There's a huge like array of symbols in the Gospels that represent this. And so Jung was pointing out that this is quite interesting. He would notice that like all these other writers, this seemed to be a motif, that some type of savior was coming. The fish was a big deal. And when Christ comes, Christ gets chosen. And Jung was wondering, it's like, well, did that symbol generating process end there? No, of course it did not. That definitely did not end there. That continued on for the next couple of couple of thousand years up to our day. It had to. The unconscious didn't vanish and end with Christ. The unconscious continued to prophesize and create all this type of stuff. Now, he doubles this also with an observation of the evolution of consciousness within man, that we have to reasonably assume that our minds are actually changing and evolving in some way. We're progressing towards something. Maybe we're progressing towards some sort of symbolic journey, or maybe we're actually like physically progressing. To give you an example, I think you've read the one by the guy who talks about the bicameral mind, Julian Jaynes.
Julian Jaynes, yeah.
And he's actually fronting a very similar thesis, that there came a point, but like in the Iliad, our brains had not actually separated as much as they have now. And there came a point around about the Bronze Age where our brains actually finally began to develop this separation, which changed the way that we even experience things like literature. And so you read the start of the Bible, and it's like, as you said, the father, the commanding father, and then you read Ecclesiastes, and it's like this sober, rational speaking character. So you can even see there this evolution of a different type of way that the mind is working. And so Jung was pointing out that the Messiah, Christ, the arrival of this symbolic revolution, was another evolution step forward in the consciousness of man. It was a raising of the consciousness, if you will. And you might not agree with that, but this is obviously his thesis. And he pointed out that the way that people understood this thing that spoke to them with these symbols was, obviously they didn't call it the unconscious. They called it the spirit. In fact, they called it the Holy Spirit. And he looks through the Gospels and he sees that Christ himself says in John, I can't remember the place, but Christ says, you can sin against me, but if you sin against the Holy Spirit, that's the highest problem. There's lots of phrases like this. This Holy Spirit is the big dog, the big G. All the Protestants would always say they'd use this to justify their escape from the righteous Catholicism, Irish Catholic religion, you know. But they love the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is in some sense that, maybe you could say, it's that right hemisphere, or it's that dreaming mind that speaks in symbols. And so Jung then began to study Christianity as this revelation, as this slow morphing of the Holy Spirit. He studied Christianity through the history of the Holy Spirit. That's what I'm trying to say. So he was watching how people related to the Holy Spirit, and he was understanding that this was actually a sort of a measure that we could follow, showing us how the consciousness of Western man was evolving. And so he started to look for characters like this. And this is where he comes across Joachim of Fiore and everything. He starts to see that in the beginning, they started, I think it was with the Benedictine monks, and they were possessed by the Holy Spirit to break away and go and set up their monasteries. And then it turned into this guy. And then the Protestant Revolution came pretty soon afterwards. And Jung was kind of pointing out that the psychological evolution of man was reaching this point now where we were casting off Christianity. He talks about the Antichrist as well quite a lot here, which is very, very fascinating. It's too much to get into for the time being. But it seemed like we were getting led towards where we are now, where it started off much more like a revelation, and now after 2,000 years, and he actually specifically pointed out that these things tend to be about 2,000 years long, the revelation is sort of complete. The Holy Spirit has shown us what it wants to show us, and we're coming into this age now where we have to develop a different relationship with it. We're like kind of preparing now for a new symbolic language. And he points out all these fascinating things like the alchemists and how they were doing very similar to before the Messiah came. There was all these guys generating all these images of fish and all this type, and all this symbolic language, like the Jews just before Christ came. He was pointing out that in the European mind, around about 500 years ago, a huge amount of new symbols began to generate. And of course, out of this comes Protestantism, science, alchemy, all this new symbolic language pops up. And it actually did end up in this massive transformation of our society, and basically a new psychological order that we instantiated upon ourselves. And he was pointing out that this was going to happen. He kind of called it a little bit. He talks about all sorts of interesting ironies, like the whole obsession about the living stone. And you're like, what the fuck does this have to do with anything? But of course, he was pointing out that a living stone is our attempt to try and make technology give us eternal life. To give you an example, like artificial intelligence is a load of minerals organized as a laptop that is actually a living entity living inside the stone, if you think about it this way. And he was pointing that we've got now this new trust towards this new symbolic language. So the Holy Spirit is pushing us in this type of direction. And so he makes a lot of prophecies about this. He talks about how we are going to enter into an age that, as you said, is going to be more literally liberal. Like we're now into a psychological age, and there's no way we can go back from this. Like all these attempts to bring Christianity back, or like maybe a more simple and intolerant world vision is very, very difficult for the West, because I think our struggle is that we've chosen to liberalize. And of course, liberalism and psychological liberalism is really what I'm talking about here, is too loose. Because it kind of to be free, you have to. We're like the kids, we're like the little birds jumping off the cliff. You know, we're gonna have to learn to fly, and we could fucking die if we're not careful. It's a big risk, but we're kind of at that point in our evolution where that has to happen. Like, it kind of becomes now a point in the future where we have to evolve to be capable of being liberal, if you will, and this will actually require an immense amount of maturity. And an awful lot of the rejection of liberalism you're seeing now is the fact that we, like, a lot of people fucked it up, you know, like the whole idea of just looseness with no aim or control is just very, very foolish. Like, they made the sort of liberalism an end in and of itself without understanding that maybe we're supposed to use that liberalism to pull us towards a higher ideal of some sort. So I've said a lot there. I just think that's a fascinating theory, and it's very interesting how your mind is modeling so similar along to what he was speaking about.
Yes, I actually have not read this work by Jung. I've actually only read kind of introductions to Jung. I've never been. I need to. I'm looking at the book right now on Amazon. I need to dive into that.
It's a very hard read because he's very heavy on the symbols. Like, Jung's not a fun read, man, to be perfectly honest. But
well, cool. I've just been editing a lot of Mark Brahman, so I'm sure it'll be a breeze.
Yeah.
In fact,
What is that? Wait, come on. Shit is profound. But no, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Jung, for whom I have great respect. I think he was headed in the right direction, and I think he's sort of ultimately a kind of rejection or move away from Freud evinces a sort of healthy instinct. But I actually think that in a lot of ways we can learn more from Freud than we can from Jung. And because REM theory, I think, is basically, it's a kind of it's against Jung ultimately. Now, I think that Jung, I think that we can accept an idea of a unconscious or a collective unconscious. I think that theory or that thesis could be valid. But I think that a lot of these myths, and this is something that is revealed in my work, REM theory, are very obviously kind of intelligently constructed and developed. And there's a symbol language that you can essentially decode through an analysis of pattern use effectively, right? So you can understand the symbol language. And this ends up accounting for a lot of the sort of similarities that we see in myth, from the ancient period to now, to Hollywood, for example. There's an intelligent, conscious use of symbols, right, where a particular symbol meaning is intended, and it's not just kind of arriving to us mystically or unconsciously and this sort of thing. That's the argument I make. Now, where I would support the thesis of a collective unconscious is that I think that could be a collective unconscious is a kind of result of that. So in other words, there is a collective unconscious, but it's consciously created by artists and religion makers, if that makes sense to you, or myth makers. Do you understand what I'm saying?
100%. And actually, I really like this. If you want to finish your talk, go ahead, because I have something to say.
Yeah. No. And I think that actually you were saying before we got on the call that you wanted to talk about religion. And what you were saying before too also struck a chord with me, that you were saying, well, here we are having these sort of abstract intellectual philosophical discussions about these things, whereas a guy like Tate is just like, fuck it, I'm Islam. Or Fuentes is like, fuck it, I'm a Catholic. And he doesn't need to understand anything beyond that, right? And there is something kind of empowering about that. You can just sort of clutch up one of these faiths as a weapon. Richard and I have used this metaphor a number of times, but like we argue that essentially Fuentes is picking up a kind of cursed sword, right, as it were. He's wielding a cursed sword, but it's a ready sword. The sword has been forged, and he can just grab it and go. You know what I mean? Whereas we're interested ultimately in the development of a religion, and one striking thing that I remember hearing from a rabbi is that when he was describing the Torah, I wish I remember the name of this. I mean, there's all these rabbis that got YouTube videos, and I think I was just kind of, I don't know why I was on the video, but and like priests, there's sort of these anonymous people that may, in the future write some meaningful midrash or something that people quote or whatever. But his observation though, or insight, I found was very very good, very insightful. He said that he said about the Torah, he said the Torah is beyond philosophy. It's not itself philosophy. It's it's the product of philosophy. It's the sort of the fruit of philosophy. And I think that that's true. And myth as well, a mythos, a religion is a fruit of philosophy. So that's why we're oriented toward a religious project ultimately. Now we're in the early stages, so yeah, we can be criticized as being like we don't have a flock that we can just say, hey, yeah, go sacrifice this goat or right. And we don't want to be doing that now, because we want to understand what we're doing, because we understand that there's a symbol language, and that what's really required for religion to be potent is a cogent and intelligent use of that symbol language. So we're proceeding in an intelligent way, but not, I don't think, in an overly careful way, because our goal is to convince intelligent people that what we're doing is correct, so that we have arguments justifying why we believe this symbol means X or this symbol means Y. Why, for example, this ritual would be moralizing, why this parable would be moralizing, and this sort of thing. I think you understand my point. Because the effort is to attract intelligent people. We're looking for an elite or leadership. We're not looking for laity or for people to just come into our temple and perform some mindless ritual and declare fealty to us. I mean, that might be something that develops naturally in the future, but at this point, it's more about proving our argument to intelligent people that would form a kind of elite. And so I think I won't go on further than that, but in any case, you were going to speak though.
Yeah, there's like so many great points to bring up in this, and like some of these are going to be gentlemen's criticisms and disagreements. So like I hope that's okay. But I 100% understand the frame of reference you're coming from. I do think it's important not to try to let's say strawman the conceptualization I'm presenting when I'm talking about, say, for example, Fuentes going with Catholicism, or someone like Jordan Peterson just defaulting towards a way that is simple and he can just put himself into Christianity and not have to think about it. Like Christianity, we have one life. We're going to live for 70, 80 years. And you need, and this is very Jungian actually, you need an awful lot more than your intellect satisfied. Like you need a wife, you need a community, you actually do need these types of rituals, like bringing your kids into a community, baptizing them. All of these are incredibly fertile institutions, symbolic institutions.
Yes.
And if you're going to bring people towards anything, these things actually are almost superordinate. Now, I think a very good point you brought up about the Torah. These things could also be understood as the blossom of hard work, and maybe on an intellectual level, but ultimately when it works, it will be the blossom. And you need to be able to bring people into the rituals. You need to be able to bring people into these things in order for this to work, even intelligent people. Like, for example, if you could have a flock of very intelligent people globalized across the West, and you had this ability to speak to young guys and young girls, almost like imagine if you had control of the universities, and you could say, you can come in here and you'll find a high IQ girlfriend at the best age of her life to meet her. She'll be studying. You'll both get like high status jobs. You'll work in intellectual spheres. You'll probably be potentially could be decision makers in the future of the world. Like that type of offer is phenomenal. It's probably more persuasive than almost anything else, and that type of thing is actually.
I don't disagree with any of the points you're making. So right,
awesome.
So, yeah, I mean, it's the idea that we're just not there yet. We're going to get there, and I think we'll get there in relatively short order. Awesome. But I think that this first step is for people to say, okay, Brahman's right, and we understand this kind of language now, essentially. Or at least we've come to a consensus on an understanding, and then we can use that to create religion, essentially.
Well, we need to clear the field. Like you can't create until you destroy. And I can absolutely 100% recognize everything that Steph just said. I mean, I have engaged in that with my own children to the degree that I can, and I understand its importance. And even as I become this, notorious figure, I kind of feel the pain of lacking some of this community and so on. That being said, we're going to have to kill God. I mean, I do, like, I understand all of the benefits of it 100%, but like, we actually are on this earth. There is a negative nihilistic quality to what we're engaging in. I mean, we are put on this earth to assault the Abrahamic deity conception. And
Well, okay.
we have to be open about that. And we maybe not open about it. We shouldn't be open about it, but we need to be open about it within our own heart. That is what we were doing.
And I should clarify as well, is that I look at, for example, Fuentes or Jordan Peterson and all this, and I understand why they go towards that way. And I can definitely see actually the wisdom in it. And wisdom is a very important form of knowledge. But it's just like, if we're going to make such a big hope, like if us Nietzscheans, us good Europeans, as he used to say, and we aspire to really do what Nietzsche was actually trying to do, which is go beyond, not resent, not like actually try to build something new, not be like a new atheist, but actually something brand new. And that's a tall fucking task. And like, we need to hit it. Everything needs to be hit. Like, a religion is a world vision. It is everything, down to how you decide to touch your dick, all the way to who you marry, all the way to how you breed, all the way to who you hang around with. That's a massive task. And then the symbolic world on top of that as well. That's so huge. It's so huge.
Yes.
And it's probably doable. This is, again, maybe another criticism, obviously for the sake of critical thinking, is how possible is that even to do rationally? Like, are we able to actually map out this giant world vision and rationally get all of those things right? This is very much how Jung would be pushing at these things. And he would say that he would expect, now think of the unconscious mind not as some irrational, useless feminine force. Think of it maybe as the right hemisphere, as this intelligent, ordering force that orders reality in a different way than our rational egos does. And he was kind of pointing out that almost like an artist needs to work with the muse, you need to work with that other side of yourself. The unconscious can help us in these goals. If it really is right for us to push forward towards these type of things, the unconscious will guide us in some sense. The dreaming mind, the imagination is probably better words to use here. And there's no reason why we should discount something like a revelation to help us. To give you an example of this that you could think about, I notice an awful lot of people get very attracted towards the idea of the symbol language that flows up, because yous are all Apollonian, and I actually understand that, and I quite like the conceptualization there. But I do see an awful lot of people drawn towards it's almost like new symbols coming up for a messiah in a different direction. Is Lucifer, Prometheus, Faust, the kind of techno-scientific man. I was just talking about like the alchemical stone being a manifestation of the AI, the living machine. And this actually does seem to be a very pregnant, energetic energy inside of Western culture. A lot of people are very attracted to this. Lucifer obviously has the very hard-coded, like anti-Christian energy inside of it, but Lucifer is interestingly a sort of flip symbol, where if you present Lucifer, I think some rabbi said once that Lucifer is the god of the Europeans, and that's why he's framed as evil inside of their heads in some sense. Prometheus is another very famous one that Nietzsche would speak about. Yeah. And it does actually capture a part of our spirit, like Faust is the famous one that Spengler talked about. And I think there's this guy called Reza Giorgiani that always bangs on about Prometheus. There's loads of other people who talk about other versions of this. And I've seen a lot of different, this show up in many different ways, and kind of showing you that maybe, I'm just pointing this out, I'm not saying this is the one, but is that a symbol? Is that like the unconscious is having a fountain moment there and revealing to us an entity? And perhaps we could kind of look at that and be like, wait a second, is that like a charged, energetic, symbolic entity that could be an asset that we could grab onto, and would it actually take us somewhere very effortlessly? And the danger of a rational attempt at something like this is that we try to build up something and force it, and it just doesn't work, because we're going against the sort of monumental trends of the Holy Spirit, if you want to put it in Joachim's of Fiore's words.
Right.
And this is something to think about, because I know Mark is, and like I think Mark's work is very good, is decoding this stuff and trying to articulate it in a rational way. And it's always something to consider. It's like if you're fighting against these monumental forces of the unconscious revealing right hemisphere imagination, it might be easier to go along with it. Like William Blake, William Blake's another great example. It might be easier to entertain the dark side and let the visions come out and see what they say. it might be easier to let Zarathustra loose and talk through you, as Nietzsche did, and see what comes along with that. So that's sort of more in the symbolic side of things. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
I basically agree with all of your admonishments. I mean, I do think that something like New Atheism, I certainly don't despise any of those figures. I admire Dawkins, etc. I would love to share dinner with him and pick his brain, but there is a kind of just terminal end point to that. Like it just cannot go anywhere, precisely because it rejects all of these things you've talked about. It reject all God is just, spaghetti monsters or whatever. It's not rational and reasonable, and it doesn't adhere to liberalism. So that is just a non-starter, that type of mentality. And I think I think we've seen its birth and peak and decline actually within our brief lifetimes. And so we have to go somewhere else. And I guess there's a balance between kind of like trying to transfigure a spiritual mode that currently exists, and that maybe more aggressive energy of like, this isn't working. This is going to lead somewhere very bad, and you've just got to make a clean break. And I think Nietzsche was kind of torn between those things. On the one hand, all of that clean break strategy is a very Nietzschean thing. I mean, he was, as I've joked, previously, like the guy was releasing like underground heavy metal albums effectively with these books that he wrote, and it's all the more.
That's like such a good way to put it. I never thought of it like that before.
Yeah, and all the more remarkable that he was this wunderkind professor. Like we expected so much from you, and instead you do this like death metal. But then on the other hand, there's a kind of esoteric side to Nietzsche. I think something like his own kind of sense of himself as Dionysus, or his labeling himself the Antichrist. He by doing things like that, he's kind of entering that spiritual dialogue. And he's not a fedora wearing new atheist who says, science is great. He's not that. He's obviously not that. And I think there's a kind of mythological quality where he's entering into that dialogue with Christianity and using Christian terms. The Antichrist isn't just like the edgy teenager on the internet. I mean, the Antichrist is a part of Christianity, and there are figures. Another Frederick. It's kind of fascinating, actually. These weird coincidences. Another Frederick who was absolutely labeled the Antichrist, and he was kind of taking on that title. So I don't know. This is just kind of my perspective on Nietzsche. I think I was first attracted to him as a teenager, as kind of raising the ground and just all of its bullshit, and let's move beyond and embrace power and all that kind of stuff. But as I get older, I think there's another kind of undercurrent to Nietzsche and another mode where he was maybe to a degree that's underappreciated, attempting to transfigure Christianity with himself as Christ.
Yeah, I definitely think this is something that people miss out on a lot. It's a very actually good criticism of the new atheist movement, because obviously the new atheists were exposing the sort of silliness of Christianity in the modern world.
Yeah,
but they were kind of picking an easy fight. They were kind of like going after Southern evangelicals or something like this.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they picked an easy fight, they sort of had soft arguments. And now you see this, Jordan Peterson begins this reactionary movement of Christians against that. And now they actually have quite a lot of force, because it's just so easy to beat up Richard Dawkins. But then you see Nietzsche floating around in the background. There's like loads of Nietzscheans, loads of them on Twitter, loads of them on the internet and all this. And they're definitely not in any way dominant. but they're floating in the background because Nietzsche's the heavy metal specter. You know, like everybody knows that Nietzsche doesn't go easy. Like he punches it right into the core, and he does all sorts of fascinating things. Like Zarathustra is in some sense I actually, when I read Zarathustra and look at Nietzsche, I begin to understand him almost like he was in some sense LARPing in a very sincere way as like Isaiah or something like this.
Yeah.
Like he's a prophet, an Old Testament prophet, and he's got that mighty feel to it. And he's in some sense looking at Christianity and Judaism and realizing that the great priests of the Jews actually had for their people this magnificent spiritual worldview, this world vision. It's absolutely profound. It's so rich and vivid. And he looks at us and he says, like, we don't really have anything like that, and maybe I should be the one to start to give us something. And he tries to act like a prophet for the Western Europeans at this very peculiar place in their spiritual history, where we are shackling off Christianity, and we are at this point where we need to have a kind of revelation and a reevaluation of our spirit. And like, I think you guys, Mark specifically, sitting down and pointing out that like Apollo is a phenomenal symbol for us, for like our rational scientific style. Like that's a brilliant observation. And we actually are at that point where we've been living that out unconsciously for a while. I point to like Lucifer, Prometheus, these other characters, because I think there's a lot in there too. And anything that can kind of grab for us our scientific modernistic spirit, but also grab that revelation, I think is a big deal. And then marry that all to these like really hardcore biological perspectives that Nietzsche talked about. And you basically have such a comprehensive answer that Richard Dawkins just couldn't provide. Richard Dawkins is asserting well-being and Christian morality without God in the sky. And now what you need to do is you actually need to give people, actually the majority of what people go for in Christianity is not the logic. They go for it because they can join a community and get married and have a fucking funeral that's not full of people dressed up as girls or men or something like this. It's life-affirming institutions. And if you could just marry those two things, a sophisticated revelation that was liberated from the Judeo-Christian paradigm and the logical the affirmative life-affirming institutions, maybe combined with the ascendant class idea of it, like you're dealing with intelligent people across the way, that could be a very interesting combo.
Yeah. So if I can defend Apollo, because I mean, so I'm not that aware of Giorgiani, exactly what he's said or what he's written. I'm kind of generally aware of it, and I know that he holds up Prometheus as a symbol. There's a kind of apropos thunder. I don't know if you heard that in the background. But he Prometheus is not our guy ultimately. I think this is sort of a misunderstanding. It's a mistake that Nietzsche makes, and it's a mistake that others made that were writing around the same time. And there's reasons why the mistake was made, but the figure himself is ultimately not a Western figure in my mind, or even an Aryan figure, I would argue. He's a fire god, and he's an opponent of Jupiter, who's the sky god, right? And he's punished by Jupiter for essentially attempting some form of usurpation or revolt against him. Like his crime famously is bringing fire to man, when Jupiter hoped to deny it. So I think that there is and what people I think admire about the character, and the reason that people are drawn to Prometheus in particular, is because he is a sort of oppressed figure. And I think that when Nietzsche is using him, he may be actually thinking of Jupiter as kind of Yahweh or Jehovah or something like this, right? Where he understands European man as sort of oppressed by a Jewish god or this sort of thing. And so he's also connected him to Lucifer. I think that connection has also been made. But I think in Lucifer is more credibly an Aryan figure. I would agree with that. I think that he is actually intended as an Aryan figure. But Prometheus is not our guy. He's a fire god. What are some other kind of proofs toward this understanding? Primarily that he's an opponent of Jupiter, but again, I think that the reason people are attracted to him is because of this rebellious energy that he represents, especially against unjust, oppressive forces, because that's really that's really sort of the upshot of his myth. But Jupiter also is this symbol, because Jupiter will also overthrow Cronus, for example, or Saturn.
Yeah.
So I think he also contains this, and I don't think that a figure like Prometheus is required to describe it. Apollo, you could even say, or you could argue that Apollo also contains this when he defeats Python, right? Jupiter will overthrow Typhon and Saturn, and Apollo will overthrow Python, and his name means rot or decadence. So I think that these things are already kind of contained in the symbols that, we're selecting Olympian symbols. We're identifying with the Olympian gods, who are evidently sort of these Aryan celestial figures. Whereas these other figures are kind of more these chthonic, peripheral, even rebellious figures, or at least against the Olympians. Prometheus is also a Titan, so he's of the race that the Olympians overthrew, so that Jupiter could become king. So I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Prometheus is not our symbol. Now, it's not to say that he's not an interesting figure that we, I mean, a German actually brought up a similar objection regarding, I think he was a reader of Nietzsche, so he was attracted to this idea of the dichotomy between Apollo and Dionysus or Bacchus. And again, I think that Nietzsche makes him is sort of not making the correct identification with Bacchus ultimately. And it's a kind of understandable mistake. It's a mistake that Tacitus makes as well. So it's something that's completely forgivable. I mean, Nietzsche's obviously a genius to which we owe a lot of our inspiration. But that is a mistake that he makes. But one of the ideas that this German, who was kind of like, well, I don't want to discard Dionysus or Bacchus. I like the idea, but there has to be this balance of rationality with creativity and this sort of thing. I think that the problem is that these things have been kind of on some level, falsely attributed to Bacchus or Dionysus, because the symbol of Apollo is a kind of complete symbol in many ways, in that he is creative. He is a creative god. He's the god of music, right? He's the leader of the muses. So some of these things that Nietzsche was kind of giving to Dionysus, he was giving in a sort of arbitrary way, I would argue. And he was creating a sort of false dichotomy. But look, I mean, a lot of the things, we do, or I have made a lot of analyses of myth that people disagree with on the DR, and I think a lot of the instinct though there is that they want to they see these as almost in the kind of same category or family as a leftist attack on like Nietzsche or something, a liberal trying to get Nietzsche out of the universities or this sort of thing, right? Just because I'm making a criticism of some conclusion he reached or some observation he reached, to use one example, or this idea of, I've made criticisms, or I have a controversial analysis of Norse myth, for example, and people are very protective of that because they see it in the same sort of family or category of some leftists saying, oh, this is racist or fascist, let's do away with it. And I'm not making the argument that we should do away with any of these things. I wouldn't argue that we should do away with the Hebrew Bible. I think it would be a massive mistake to get rid of these things because they contain so much understanding, and they allow us, wisdom that allows us to see, really the way that things have gone and the way that Jews think and the way that they understand us, and also ways in which we can better understand ourselves through their lens, through a kind of way that, because we're being seen from the outside, so we can also see our sort of flaws. And, because some of the things that they're saying about us are essentially correct. And so they're revealing to us blind spots effectively. So I think that, Giorgiani, I think also is,
Oh, he popped out there.
I was going to ask, is Giorgiani got him, did he?
He summoned the spirit of Zarathustra as a Persian.
Yeah, he's all. Yeah, and actually, I mean, on some level, Giorgiani seems to be he seems to have kind of inverted the correct understanding, like maybe not completely, but he seems to have inverted the correct understanding of the symbol language, where the symbol of fire, for example, becomes associated with the Aryan, right? So he's thinking of these fire temples, but much more consistently, the symbol of fire, especially in earthly fire, we can associate with figures like Yahweh or Vulcan or Hephaestus. And so I argue that it ultimately has a kind of Semitic significance. So I think he's completely wrong in his symbol understanding on this like very important central point. So that's a kind of incompatibility that we have. And that might also, I think he's also a fan of Heraclitus, but I think he correctly identifies a sort of genealogy of myth and ultimately kind of esoteric fire worship that's going through not only Greco-Roman myth, but also philosophy, right? Heraclitus would be a kind of primary example there, where he understands that the arch element or the primary element is fire, right? So there's an incompatibility there. I think that also the thing that I dislike about Giorgiani, which I think that you might be advocating or promoting, is that he's ultimately an occultist, and I think that there is a kind of superstitious like subtext or whatever to his work. So he's believing in flying saucers and this sort of thing, and I don't see that as useful. I don't see that as So in other words,
No.
I think our perspective is more of the Roman perspective, who looks at the Christian as superstitious ultimately, right? And that's one of the reasons that he condemns the Christian, because he's superstitious. He believes in superstitions. And he also condemns him as being an atheist, right? So what does that tell you? That the Roman is neither superstitious, yet he's still a theist. He still believes in the gods, but his concept of the gods is completely different from the concept that Christians have, or these other kind of like more emotional cults have, where you say that there's a passion there that we can harness for this sort of thing. I think that's what you're implying. But I think that there is also a kind of a sobriety that we can channel from the Romans, where we're looking at these things as, basically as being kind of cults that are insane on some level, right? Now, if your criticism is that we're not, that there has to be a kind of passion there, I agree with that, but I think that a lot of the passion comes from poets, it comes from artists, it comes from the myth makers and the creators of the religion itself, because the religion itself is a kind of type of poetry that becomes an expression of the philosophy or the ideas or the understanding. And so my goal is to give that language to the artists and to the myth makers, and hopefully I'll also get an opportunity to create some of those myths myself. But also that, the people that would form rituals and this sort of thing. But everything that you're describing, we want, but we're just not there yet, because this is the beginning, and which I think is a kind of exciting and great place to be. I mean, honestly.
Yeah.
Awesome. That all makes a lot of sense as well. And I absolutely understand. I know there's a few questions there, but I guess one point I'll just say is that maybe like you got to be a bit wary about which comes first, the chicken or the egg question, like, can we be rational about these things, or is it an instance where these things are in some sense revealed? Like I think what Nietzsche would be pointing out in terms of Dionysus is not like, it obviously can be interpreted as this surrender to the irrational and giving in to the passions and the instincts.
Yeah.
But I think a true artist, like any really high quality artist, is a unity of the rational and the passionate. It's a unity of Apollo and Dionysus in some sense. Like if you listen to Mozart or Beethoven, they're obviously extremely passionate.
It's Apollo though, because Apollo is also passionate. Apollo is a warrior. He's a lover. He's all these things, right?
True,
so
yeah.
I'm saying it's a kind of arbitrary, it seems what's happening is that people are taking these sort of necessary attributes and they're giving them to Bacchus, and therefore we have to include Bacchus. But Apollo, I would argue, already contains all these things. I contain multitudes. What is this sort of common liberal, that is Apollo. He contains
Walt
multitudes.
Whitman, yeah.
True, and he is a god of revelation as well. He is a god of prophecy. I know that. He reveals. He's these types of things. And look, I like no beef with Apollo. I'm not here to give him beat up. I actually really like the symbol, but I guess I'm sort of talking about the idea of how some of these things are generated. And I do obviously think like a rational schema is very, very useful, but I also think that there's room for that idea of inspiration, and it should be, I'd always be wary of discounting that, like even
No,
my
I'm not. Look, I'm not. So,
Yeah.
and I think that really is like, the older you get, the more critical your mind gets. And when you're young, you're very creative. But a lot of your ideas are bad or dumb, or you know what I mean? But you're creative. You have that energy to create. When you're older, you get more critical. So you're better at sort of pruning bad ideas, if that makes sense to you. You know what I mean?
Of course, yeah. Of course.
But so I think I think it definitely requires both. So I wouldn't discount that what you're saying, and I think I'm understanding more clearly what you're saying. I mean, it definitely requires that kind of that passion, that love, that energy, that artist's energy. But I think that is contained. To give credit to Jews, I think that that's contained evidently in the Hebrew Bible. That's contained in the New Testament. That passion, and yet there's a logic there. Right.
Yeah.
So
that's really it. Yeah.
Both can occur. So, I mean, you can be an artist and you can describe the human condition in this very familiar and compelling way, but you still can also have this symbol language working in the background that's accomplishing this bigger thing. You can accomplish both things simultaneously if I'm making myself clear to you. You know what I mean? So in other words, what REM theory does is it gives the artist a greater purpose. He doesn't sort of have to stop being what he is, or using the sort of talents and skills that are innate to him, and or the things that he's passionate about or wants to talk about. But it gives him a way of like, okay, well, let's also put in this message about how Apollo defeats Python or whatever, right? Because that becomes moralizing. I think you understand my point.
100%.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested in seeing, because people, there's a lot of people out there who, as I'm pointing out, talking about this Jungian stuff, the Holy Spirit, the unconscious, the imagination, or even just the passions. A lot of people are very, very wrought and full with passions, and they're seeking something to channel those passions into. I also think there's a very interesting point here. So like, if you can find those people and you can present to them a schema, or present to them, or even better, like you can describe them as saying that urge you feel inside yourself is literally Apollo, like your desire to create a sort of myth or a story or a film that celebrates, you could say, Western identity, is actually a manifestation of the Apollonian inside of you that's trying to be born. And here's a schema that you can actually use to help guide you along that process. And so if the artist feels like he is actually giving birth to something from inside their own soul, because that's important to all artists, but there's also like this sort of guiding light that's taking them along this as well, which would be the rational knowledge you're providing them. And I don't want to frame it as like purely rational, but you're giving them a framework that they can help. You're like a midwife helping them give birth to their revelation, if you want to put it this way. And there's something very interesting about that, something very, very powerful about that, because that's ideally like where both of those two things marry together, and you can see what's inside of us, what's inside of our souls talking, and then it's given clear view, and then we actually understand what it is. And I think this is where things like the Bible, or should I say the Torah, came from. They seemed like they came from this way. They were revealed and then they were understood, and then that turned into the powerful world vision that they have now. So it's good overall, though. Really,
well,
I like
there's nothing more passionate really than the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. I mean, that is passion. And the scribes who wrote it felt that passion. But they also had this other thing, right? Where they were like, okay, well, let's make this work for us. Let's make this have this psychological power, give this message, embed this message, and make it work on all levels. And you can have both. And I guess, I wouldn't call that passionate side Dionysus. I would just call it a sort of a well-rounded Apollo might be a better way of looking at it, right? Where he's a man, he has both these things, of course.
Maybe I would suggest this, and then I'll move on to questions. But there might be a positive Caducean dynamic between Apollo and Dionysus, and that will, every religion needs a Satan, but that Satan buttresses and justifies the religion. I think it is important to identify with Apollo and not a figure like Dionysus, to say the least. But I think maybe forcing Dionysus out of our worldview might be a mistake.